Hey guys, Madame Ram, starring Toni Collette, tells the dramatized true story of Georgia Frontier, a former entertainer turned owner and heavy hitter in the boys' club that is the NFL. After her husband's mysterious death, she shocks everyone by inheriting the LA Rams and taking the reins of a major sports franchise. Relying on her wit and astrological charts to make decisions, she turns the NFL on its head and to this day remains one of the most beloved, despised, and controversial figures in modern sports. You guys, I started listening to this and I am absolutely hooked. The twists and turns, I didn't see any of them coming, and I have so many questions. I cannot wait to continue to tune in. The woman who went from singer to NFL owner, defying expectations and shaking up the world of professional football. Madame Ram dives into her relentless quest for respect, power, and a championship trophy. This isn't your typical sports story. Follow Georgia Frontier as she navigates a male-dominated industry using star charts and sheer determination to make her mark in history. Whether you love football, powerful struggles, or just a good scandal, Madame Ram has it all. Ambition, mystery, and the unforgettable legacy of a woman who refused to stay on the sidelines. Madame Ram, the woman who took on a man's world and won. Follow Madame Ram on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now.
Holy shit!
What you've just heard is one of the many deaths from the monkey, the new major motion picture from Osgood Perkins, Stephen King, and James Wan. Experience it in theaters everywhere this Friday, because everybody dies, and that's life. Let's have some fun.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Big Mad True Crime, where we get big mad over true crime. I'm your host, Heather Ashley, and today's case is out of Woodinville, Washington. Small talk sucks, so let's dive in. Michael Emert, better known as Mike, was a man who was just so well liked by everyone who knew him. He had this incredible sense of humor. He was friendly and super personable. He was the kind of guy you'd be honored to call your friend. Mike grew up in Walla Walla, Washington, and that has to be my favorite city name ever. After graduating high school there, he attended Washington State University. Following his time in college, he became an owner of a seed business. When that venture ended, Mike moved to the Seattle area and became a realtor. He worked in the Bellevue office of Windermere Real Estate, where he remained until his death. Mike then married his soulmate, Mary Beth, and Mary Beth later told Unsolved Mysteries that she and Mike were best friends. They were constantly on the phone with each other when they weren't together. They simply enjoyed each other's company all day, every day, and wanted to be around each other all the time. Mary Beth's parents were also huge fans of Mike. Her father told the Seattle Times, "Mike was my favorite buddy. He was one of those son-in-laws that doesn't come along too often. He was a good man." Mary Beth had a daughter who was around 5 years old when she and Mike got married. Mike and Mary Beth's daughter were extremely close. He coached her basketball team for 2 years before his death, and he also took her to Sonics games all the time. After getting married, Mike and Mary Beth worked together in the same realty office, where Mike was known as a popular and uber-successful agent. A spokesman for the realty company told the Seattle Times, Mike was highly regarded as a professional who went out of his way to help the client. His colleagues defined him as an amazing person because of his energy, sense of humor, and integrity. Mike was actually so good at his job that for 2 years in a row, he was recognized as a top Puget Sound real estate professional. At the time of his death, he had several listings for properties worth more than $1 million, which would be worth almost double today. In the late morning hours of January 4th, 2001, Mike showed a house in the 19,500 block of 157th Place Northeast in Woodinville, which is just outside of Seattle. The house was located on a wooded cul-de-sac in an upscale neighborhood. The owner of the home, who we're going to call Annie, was still living there, but she wasn't home during the showing. The Seattle Times reported that Annie didn't actually know Mike. She had listed her house with a realtor from a completely different company. Mike was just showing the house to his client. At around 12:30 p.m. on January 4th, Annie arrived home on her lunch break. When she got there, she thought she was home alone since there were no cars in the driveway. She figured Mike had finished up the viewing of the house already, so she went in. Annie entered through the garage and was surprised to find that the front door was open. She heard the sound of running water upstairs, so she went up to investigate, but that's when she found a trail of wet blood leading from a bedroom towards a bathroom. Annie went into the bathroom and found the 2 faucets in the vanity sink still running, as well as the shower faucet. She then saw Mike lying face down in the bathtub portion of the shower. An autopsy would later show that he had been stabbed at least 19 times with a knife or something similar. Annie called 911 to frantically report what she had found. When police arrived, they looked around the scene and determined that Mike had been attacked and killed in the bedroom. It looked like a blitz attack. According to the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, he was likely hit from behind, then stabbed repeatedly. Mike was then dragged 18 feet down the hallway to the bathroom, where he was lifted into the shower. Police theorized the killer turned the faucets on to wash trace evidence from Mike's body and possibly off of himself and the murder weapon, which was not left behind. Mike's 2000 black Cadillac Escalade, wallet, watch, and a diamond ring were all missing from the scene.
Good night, itchy eyes. Good night, sudden sneeze. Good night to your symptoms of allergies. Zysol is the allergy medicine you take before bed. It provides powerful relief while you rest your head. Not just all night, but all the next day. Zysol keeps working, keeping allergies at bay. And without those annoying symptoms disturbing your rest, you can wake up the next morning feeling your absolute best. Remember, be wise all. Take Zysol. At night.
The police set out to figure out what exactly happened to Mike. When they spoke to Mary Beth, they learned that on January 3rd, the day before Mike was found murdered, he showed Annie's house to a man who said his name was Steven. He claimed to be from California and was looking to relocate to the Seattle area. Mike described Steven to Mary Beth as a weird dude in his 50s who used a cane and walked with a limp and talked in an East Coast accent. After viewing the house on the 3rd, Steven said he wanted to see it again the next day, so Mike agreed to meet with Steven at a local mall at 11:30 a.m. Mike was going to pick Steven up there and then drive him to view Annie's house again. Mary Beth later told the Seattle Post-Intelligencer that she thought it was odd that Steven wanted to meet Mike at the mall. Usually, clients wanted to meet at the office or at the property they wanted to view, so she said that was a real red flag. But Mike probably didn't think much of it at the time because most realtors assumed crimes would only be committed against female realtors and not the male ones. Also, murders in the area where the home was located were extremely rare. There hadn't been one for years. After finding out about how Mike was showing the house to a guy named Steven, police theorized that he was the killer and they started a search for him. They spoke to neighbors and learned that a neighbor actually saw Mike's Escalade driving away from the house prior to 12:30 p.m. on the 4th. The police believed the killer was the one driving the car. While the police set out to find Mike's stolen car and the killer, Investigators were processing Annie's house for any additional evidence, but absolutely no DNA evidence was found in that house. This made it clear that the person who killed Mike had been extremely careful. According to Unsolved Mysteries, the police believe that the murder was meticulously planned and executed. They theorized this for multiple reasons. One, the location of the house was very specific. It was remote and in an area where no one would expect a murder to happen. And the killer knew Mike would come to the showing alone. The police further believed that the killer met with Mike the day before the murder to familiarize himself with the layout of Annie's home. Another reason police theorized the murder was meticulously planned was because of the lack of evidence left behind. The way the faucets were turned on to wash away any evidence suggested to police that this might not be Stephen's first crime, especially not his first violent act. But before police could even start looking into that, Mike's Escalade was found abandoned at a nearby shopping center in Kirkland on the night of January 4th. The Escalade was later searched, and the police were able to recover blood from the killer. The DNA was run through all databases, but unfortunately, there were no matches. Around that same time, it was also determined that the killer's DNA was also under Mike's fingernails, but again, the DNA was entered into the system without a match. On January 5th, Mike's wallet was found at Coleman Dock, the state ferry terminal. His debit card was not inside. Mike's watch and ring weren't there either, and as far as I can tell, they are still missing to this day. Based on the locations of the Escalade and the wallet, police believe that the killer drove the Escalade away from the house, dropped it off at the shopping center, then took the bus to Seattle, or the killer had a second car waiting for him at that shopping center. The Associated Press reported that on the 5th, Mike's phone was also found, although police wouldn't say exactly where they located it. The only thing they would say was that they looked through his phone records and learned that his phone was used hours after his death. On January 6th, the police publicly revealed for the first time that they were looking for Stephen, who they referred to as a person of interest in Mike's murder. They gave his description and said that he was thought to be from California. Behind the scenes, police were still trying to figure out who would want to hire a hitman to kill Mike. They interviewed multiple relatives and gave them polygraphs to see if they possibly would have hired a hitman to kill Mike, but all of them, including Mary Beth, were ruled out. Police also looked to see if any rival realtor might want to hire a hitman to kill him, but they couldn't find anything to suggest that. The police looked into Mike's background and found that he had never been in trouble with the law before and didn't have any enemies. Police later told Unsolved Mysteries that they interviewed hundreds of people who knew Mike. They even looked into the people he owned his seed business with, but they couldn't find a single person who could come up with any reason for why Mike might be killed. Mary Beth also racked her brain, but she couldn't think of one person. By the end of January, the police were no closer to solving Mike's murder than they were on the day that it happened. A $50,000 reward was put up for information which would lead to Mike's killer, but still, the case went unsolved and reporting on the case slowed down substantially. At some point prior to the 1-year mark, Unsolved Mysteries filmed a special on Mike's murder. During the filming, police revealed that they believe Stephen was likely a hitman. However, they weren't sure why anyone would be hired to kill Mike. Police also revealed that they thought it was possible that Stephen faked having a limp. Their reason for this thought was that an older man with a real limp would not have been able to overpower Mike, who was nearly 6 feet tall and 187 pounds. The killer also had to be strong in order to drag Mike's body to the bathroom and then lift him into the shower. Police said it was possible that the murder weapon was Steve's cane. The cane was possibly a sword cane or a cane with a knife in it. They believed Stephen struck Mike with the cane from behind, then used the knife portion of the cane to stab Mike repeatedly. After the Unsolved Mysteries episode came out, Mike's case continued to remain unsolved. By the 1-year anniversary, things had changed in the Washington realty community. One of Mike's co-workers told the Seattle Times that Mike's death made the community examine its perception that female agents were more vulnerable to attacks. Although Mike's company already had safety precautions in place, they realized that they needed to increase them. So multiple agents from the area came together to create the Washington State Real Estate Safety Council, a group dedicated to minimizing risks for the real estate agents and their clients. The Washington governor also proclaimed a week in September to be Real Estate Safety Awareness Week. Additional rules were set in place for real estate agencies in the area. New clients had to meet with agents in the office, and before an agent could show a house, the client had to show ID and provide license plate numbers. Furthermore, agents were told to program 911 into their cell phones and to set up prearranged distress signals, for example, saying, "I need the red file," which people back in the office would know. In January of 2003, 2 years had passed since Mike was murdered. The police and Mary Beth spoke to the Seattle Times and provided an update on the case. The police said that Mike's case was not cold and they were still tracking leads. Mary Beth said that she was still deeply mourning Mike. She would visit his grave on the 4th day of every month and on important dates like Christmas, which was Mike's favorite holiday, and their wedding anniversary. Mary Beth said, "I've been putting his murder and his death in 2 separate places because if I dwelt on the fact that he was murdered, I'm pretty sure I'd never get out of bed. But because there hadn't been an arrest, she hadn't been able to move forward." Mary Beth said, "It's just like being blown up from the inside out. I do feel not having that closure is definitely standing in the way of me saying my final goodbyes to Mike." Mary Beth continued on, stating, "I'm trying to be patient, and I just know someday they'll call and have good news for me. I know when they catch someone, I'll be reliving the whole thing, but I'm so ready to go and fight for justice for Mike." In 2004, 3 years had passed. Mary Beth spoke to the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. She was still frequently visiting Mike's grave. She went on birthdays, holidays, and their anniversary. Mary Beth said she would never lose hope that his case would be solved. However, it was in God's hands now. Mary Beth was still trying to get exposure for Mike's case. She taped an appearance on Montel Williams the month before. She also spoke with other real estate agents to share Mike's story and urge agents to please be safe. Police provided an update revealing that tips had gone nowhere and they didn't really have a direction to go. They still didn't know who Mike really met with. They didn't know if Stephen was even his real name or how accurate the description Mike gave was.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. From your morning podcast to your afternoon playlist, State Farm knows you personalize your entire day, and that's why State Farm helps you personalize your insurance with the State Farm Personal Price Plan. It offers coverage options that help protect what you care about most at an affordable price just for you. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices vary by state. Options selected by customer. Availability and eligibility may vary.
Reporting slowed down even further as the years passed. But in July of 2010, the FBI matched the DNA from the killer in Mike's case to former Seattle police officer turned criminal named Gary Kruger. What's crazy is the fact that the FBI wasn't even trying to solve Mike's murder. Gary's DNA from an unrelated felony conviction was entered into the system, and that's when it was matched. Gary was also linked to 3 other unsolved murders, Mario Vaccarino, Jim Barry, and Terry Dolan. So who in the fuck is Gary Kruger, and why did he kill Mike, Mario, Jim, and Terry? Well, according to the Chinook Observer article written by Natalie St. John, Gary Kruger was born and raised in the Seattle area. Before he graduated high school, he enlisted in the Marine Corps after his brother-in-law talked him into it. Gary then convinced 7 of his close friends to enlist as well. In November of 1967, Gary, his brother-in-law, and his 7 friends headed to Vietnam to serve as combat infantrymen. Within a year, Gary was part of a special group called the Combined Action Group. This elite team, made up of Marines and the Navy, lived in distant villages where they engaged in both humanitarian work and psychological operations. Natalie St. John reported in her article for the Chinook Observer that during his time in Vietnam, Gary saw terrible acts committed against Vietnamese villagers by other Americans. He also witnessed the tragic deaths of several close friends, including 6 of the 7 friends he recruited to enlist with him. Gary's brother-in-law also died. Gary returned to the U.S. in December of 1968, and the people who knew him said that war changed him, which I bet it did. In January of 1969, Gary was discharged from the military. 6 months later, he joined the Seattle Police Department, and over the next 4 years, he got married, had a daughter, and joined the Army Reserves. Gary's time in the police force was not without incident, though. In April of 1970, he used a wrestling move to control a fellow veteran who was being violent and uncontrollable and was supposedly posing a threat to hospital staff. Tragically, the man died directly because of the restraint Gary used. The hospital director praised Gary for his actions, and his supervisor kept the incident a secret. According to a psychologist Gary later saw, that death haunted Gary. Natalie St. John reported that Gary continued having problems in the police department. In 1974, the Seattle PD paid $3,000 to a man who Gary and his partner had severely beaten in a police parking garage. Then in 1997, Gary was sitting in his police patrol car when a prowling suspect approached him unexpectedly through the driver's side window. He attempted to stab Gary with a large kitchen knife, so Gary shot the suspect 4 times until he died. A jury ruled that Gary's actions were justified, but this incident took a huge toll on Gary's health, career, and his marriage. At some point along the way, Gary also developed a gambling addiction. He called it a gambling fever and said that it was part of what led to his marriage ending. The addiction also made him desperate for money, which was a very dangerous combination. Gary's time on the force continued to be a struggle, and in 1979, a person who was under the influence of PCP tried to shoot Gary with his own gun. Gary responded by brutally beating the individual, and he only stopped when other officers arrived at the scene. As a result, he was taken off of active duty and sent to see a psychologist for evaluation. According to Natalie St. John, the psychologist determined that Gary was a liability. He wrote, Gary was becoming increasingly unable to control his temper and was becoming physically abusive to suspects and exercising excessive force. The president of the Seattle Officers Guild warned Gary that if he didn't quit his job, he would make sure that Gary was removed. Friends further advised Gary to leave the police force before he harmed himself or someone else. In early 1980, Gary did leave the police force and the Army Reserves on a disability retirement. At this time, Gary and his ex-wife got back together, and he promised to stop gambling, but he just couldn't stay away. Gary also tried to start a new career in real estate, but things weren't going well for him. He wasn't doing well financially, which left him a desperate man. And we know what lengths people will go to when they're desperate. In February of 1981, around a year after Gary left the force, a retired Seattle police officer named Terry Dolan was murdered. KIRO TV reported that after Terry retired from the force, he'd opened up a gas station in Everett. On February 2nd of 1981, someone killed Terry during a robbery of the gas station. He'd been counting money from the cash register when someone came in and shot him. A neighbor heard a loud bang, then squealing tires, and when they looked outside, they saw a metallic blue-green colored car drive away at around 90 miles an hour. According to Terry's wife, police immediately had a suspect, Gary Kruger. He and Terry had been friends for a while. They worked on the Seattle police force together. But despite having a suspect in mind, Gary wasn't arrested, and the case went cold until 2010 when Gary was linked via DNA. Things continued to get worse for Gary financially, and by 1982, he couldn't find a job anywhere and he had to declare bankruptcy. According to Natalie St. John, in 1983, Gary's personality had changed even more. His criminal accomplice and longtime friend, Carl Keller, later said that he first began to see another side of Gary around this time. He described Gary as a compulsive gambler who talked of physical harm to anyone who put him or his family in jeopardy. Then, in 1984, real estate attorney Jim Barry was murdered. On February 7, 1984, Jim went to an unusually late evening appointment at his office with a mysterious client. He never returned home. At around 3 a.m., Jim's wife found his body. He'd been shot 5 times and stabbed 11 times. The office was torn apart, but only Jim's wallet, watch, and jewelry were missing. Police believe the robbery was a ruse to throw people off the tracks. They believe that Jim had been targeted. You see, Jim's work mainly focused on real estate and fraudulent bankruptcy cases. And before he was killed, he'd confided in his friends that he knew some harmful information about an influential person. Detectives suspected that this influential person hired someone to kill Jim and prevent him from revealing whatever information it was that he had. Evidence suggested that at least 2 people killed Jim, but the case went unsolved until 2010 when Gary was linked via DNA. By the summer of 1984, Gary and his crime buddy Carl were both going through really tough financial times, so Gary asked Carl to commit a bank robbery with him. According to Carl, he reluctantly agreed to do just one. But they ended up doing more than one because after each holdup, Gary would gamble away the money and then bully Carl into committing another, which, that's his take. In June of 1984, Gary and Carl robbed a bank near Aberdeen. They tried to rob a Greyland bank on October 1st, but were unable to go through with it because the bank closed an hour before they actually got there. 3 days later, on October 4th, Gary was caught using stolen credit cards at a mall in Linwood. Natalie St. John reported that Gary gave arresting officers a name that he had used as an undercover cop. He also told police that the credit cards weren't exactly stolen. He'd gotten them from a friend he gambled with who had borrowed $1,500 during a trip to Vegas. When his friend was pressed to repay the money, he offered Gary the chance to use the credit cards for shopping instead. Police did not believe that story, and Gary was charged with using said stolen credit cards. After being charged, Gary applied to join a program designed for first-time offenders. Gary's co-worker for the deferral program called the shopping spree an isolated incident, saying that it was highly unlikely that Gary was involved in any further criminal activity. He was given a suspended sentence and probation and was released shortly after. On October 26th, Gary and Carl started a bank robbing spree, which led the FBI to get involved. But they weren't able to solve the cases for a while, so in 1985 and 1986, Gary and Carl continued robbing more banks. Then in October of 1985, Mario Vaccarino was murdered. KIRO Team 7 reported that on October 25, 1985, the badly beaten body of Mario Vaccarino, who was the Seattle Hotel and Restaurant Employee Union's president, was found in the bathtub of his home. The water was still running, and Parmesan cheese was found sprinkled over his body, which, according to police, was some sort of calling for a mob hit or a rat. The house looked ransacked, which police thought was staged, and Mario's car was stolen and abandoned several miles away. His wallet was also found at a local strip club. Police investigated Mario's murder, but there were endless possible motives here. According to KIRO 7, there were rumors that Mario was cooperating with a federal organized crime investigation. A commission in Chicago was looking into allegations of racketeering, kickbacks, tax evasion, and embezzlement of union funds. Mario's case, just like the others, went unsolved until 2010 when DNA from Mike's murder was matched to Gary's. After Mario was murdered, Gary and Carl continued robbing banks. On October 21st, 1986, the duo robbed their last bank together. According to Natalie St. John's article for the Chinook Observer, Gary and Carl fled the bank separately. As Gary drove away, he passed by a Grays Harbor County deputy. The deputy thought Gary looked suspicious, so he checked the car's license plate and found that it had been stolen. The deputy tried to pull Gary over, but he wasn't doing it, so a chase ensued with speeds reaching 100 miles an hour. Gary eventually lost control and crashed, and when the deputy walked up to the car, Gary was bleeding and unconscious. The deputy called for an ambulance, and Gary was rushed to the hospital with a badly broken leg, fractured ribs, and head and chest injuries. He did later fully recover. Inside Gary's car, police found 2 duffel bags. Inside, there were 2 rubber masks meant to look like old men, a police scanner, ski caps, a blue revolver, and a smaller handgun. Grays Harbor deputies reached out to other departments to see if there were any other robberies involving men wearing old man masks, and multiple counties reached out to say there were. The FBI then called a meeting with all of the local departments and said that they noticed a multitude of similarities in at least 6 heists between 1984 and 1986. The similarities were the apparent leader always carried a police radio and used a blue revolver. He always demanded big money and traveler's checks, and the pair almost always drove off in a recently stolen 66 or 67 Plymouth. At this point, the police knew at least one of the robbers was Gary. So, Natalie St. John reported that the police went and got a warrant to search Gary's house. They found a briefcase filled with the checks that had been stolen from the banks, so police then set out to find his accomplice. In November, Carl turned himself into police, and he ended up confessing to 8 robberies that he had committed with Gary. In the end, Carl and Gary took plea deals. Gary was sentenced to 15 years, but he only served about 7 of them. His wife and daughter stood by him through the entire thing.
Wow.
What's up?
I just bought and financed a car through Carvana in minutes.
You? The person who agonized 4 weeks over whether to paint your walls eggshell or off-white bought and financed a car in minutes?
They made it easy. Transparent terms, customizable down and monthly. Didn't even have to do any paperwork.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Hey, have you checked out that spreadsheet I sent you for our dinner options?
Finance your car with Carvana and experience total control. Financing subject to credit approval.
In 1992, Gary was released from prison. 9 years later, in January of 2001, Mike Emert was murdered. Of course, the police didn't know for many years that Gary was the one responsible for that murder. Then in February of 2001, Gary robbed an Issaquah bank. 2 months later, he went back to rob the same bank, but he was arrested while trying to flee. He took a plea and was given 70 months, but as a condition of his plea deal, he was ordered to submit a DNA sample upon his release. According to Natalie St. John, in 2004, Gary was released from prison and put on probation. He did not end up submitting his DNA, but a few years later, his probation officer lobbied for Gary's early release from supervision, saying he was not considered to be a danger to the community. In 2007, Gary finally gave his DNA sample. However, due to a backlog of more than 300,000 samples, Gary's sample wouldn't be entered into the national system until July of 2010, which is what ultimately led him to being tied to the murders of Mike, Mario, Jim, and Terry. But right before that happened, Gary actually died in a drowning accident. The Seattle Times reported that on the night of March 26, 2010, 62-year-old Gary Kruger and an accomplice, 64-year-old John Bradshaw, showed up at the home of an orthopedic surgeon who lived with his wife and children in a lakefront property off of Lake Washington. The surgeon, who we'll refer to as Aaron, and his wife did not know Gary or John. It's unclear exactly what Gary and John planned to do at the house, but they each had at least one gun and brought along a duffel bag filled with zip ties, duct tape, stun guns, and extra ammo. Gary and John, who were wearing all black and ski masks, hid near the garage and waited for Aaron to come home. At around 10:30 that night, Aaron and his son, who was a college student at the time, got back. They parked on the street because the driveway was blocked by a load of mulch that had been delivered earlier that day, and Aaron's wife and daughter were inside. They had absolutely no idea what was going on. Aaron and his son started walking towards the house, but as they did that, either John or Gary popped out from between the mulch in the garage and told Aaron and his son that he had a gun and no one would get hurt as long as they cooperated. According to the Seattle Times, Aaron lunged for the gunman's throat while his son ran to a neighbor's house to call 911. Aaron started punching the gunman, but he started zapping Aaron with that stun gun. Then the other man, either John or Gary, came around the corner of the house and pistol whipped Aaron from behind. One of the gunmen then went to the front door and tried to kick it in. Aaron's wife opened the door and saw a man dressed in all black. He was yelling at her, so she slammed the door, deadbolted it, and called 911. The gunman then went back to where Aaron and the other gunman were at, and the two men tried to talk Aaron into letting them into the house. Aaron obviously refused, and one of the men pointed the gun at him. The men soon realized that the cops were coming, though, so they decided to give the whole thing up. They demanded Aaron's car keys, but he refused that too because he knew his house key was attached to the car keys and he didn't want to give them access to his house. So Gary and John told Aaron to lay on the ground while they left. After Gary and John fled, they were never seen alive again. The Seattle Times reported that when the two gunmen were gone, Aaron rushed inside of his house. His wife said that she'd already called the cops and police were on their way into the neighborhood. Police used a K-9 team and a helicopter with heat-seeking equipment to try and search for the two gunmen, but they were unable to find either. Of course, at this time, they didn't know that the assailants were Gary and John. One of the assailant's ski masks had been torn off of his head during the attack, so that was sent off for testing. From the start, the police didn't think that the attack on Aaron and his family was a typical burglary. They believed that they had been targeted, but they couldn't figure out why. While the police continued searching for the assailants, Gary's wife actually filed a missing persons report for him. According to the Seattle Times, she described him as being broke and desperate for money. She said the last time she saw Gary, he and John Bradshaw were supposedly on their way to Bremerton in a van. Police looked for Gary and found the van that he and John had been driving abandoned in a strip mall parking lot about a mile from Aaron's house, but Gary and John were nowhere to be found. So the police continued to search for both of those men. It wasn't until July that the DNA from the stocking cap ripped off during the attack was matched to Gary's friend and fellow missing person, John. Police knew that John was 64 years old when he went missing, and he didn't seem to be your typical home invasion burglar. They looked at his record and saw that he had spent time in federal prison for arson and money laundering. The Seattle Times reported that because the police knew Gary had a lengthy criminal history, they theorized that Gary must have been John's accomplice during the would-be home invasion at Aaron's house. It all made sense considering he was last seen with John on the day of the attack. But police still couldn't figure out a motive for why John and Gary would attack Aaron. During that exact same time frame, the FBI finally got around to putting Gary's DNA from his felony conviction into the national database. Immediately after it was entered, Gary's DNA was matched to multiple unsolved murders: Mike, Mario, Jim, and Terry. So the police were more motivated than ever to continue looking for Gary and John. In September, Gary's body was found floating in Lake Washington. Police searched the lake further, and they didn't find John's body, but they did find a 9-foot aluminum boat that had been stolen from one of Aaron's neighbors. According to the Seattle Times, the boat was partially submerged in the lake near Gary's body, and inside the boat was a duffel bag with duct tape, zip ties, and extra ammo. Based on those findings, police theorized that after fleeing from Aaron's house, Gary and John stole the boat and then tried to make it across the lake, but something went wrong and the boat sank. The men likely tried to swim, but you would have to be a pretty good swimmer to make it across the lake in March in the middle of the night. Even though they never found John's body, police believe that he drowned alongside Gary. However, because John was never found, Aaron and his family feared for their safety. They had no idea if John was still alive and would come back to finish the job. Apparently, the neighbor whose boat was stolen told Aaron that he only saw one set of footprints on his property, and this led Aaron to wonder if John had escaped and was out there somewhere. Aaron hired sonar body recovery specialists to try and find John's body in the lake, but they didn't find him. To this day, John has never been found. The police continued trying to figure out any kind of motive for the attack on Aaron and his family, but in the end, they could only find one connection. Aaron had previously said that he wouldn't perform Gary's wife's knee replacement surgery, but that's such a wild thing to attack someone over, but it does seem like Gary may have been willing to kill anyone over any little thing. That was a lot of information to take in, so let's do a recap here. In July of 2010, the police determined that Gary was also involved in the attack of Aaron and his family, as well as the murders of retired police officer and gas station owner Terry Dolan, real estate attorney Jim Barry, union president Mario Vaccarino, and real estate agent Mike Emert. In 2011 and 2012, the police told the public about Gary's relation to all of these murders. They said they suspected Gary killed Terry, although they weren't 100% sure that he was responsible. They didn't give a possible motive, but it could be because Gary was desperate for money and wanted Terry's gas station cash. The police said Gary was definitely the killer of Jim Barry. They believe Gary had an associate with him during the murder, however, they weren't sure who that was. According to the police, the motive for Jim's murder was simply revenge. They told KIRO7, "We know that Jim worked for Rayner Bank at the time. There was correspondence between the bank and Gary that he had some outstanding loans that he needed to pay. There was some direct correspondence from Jim's office to Gary's home that he needed to pay those bills, and that was the motive." The police further told the public that Gary was the killer of Mario Vaccarino. Gary was actually army buddies with a longtime person of interest in Mario's murder who we're going to call Bob. After Gary was matched to Mario's murder via DNA, the police theorized that Gary killed Mario as a favor to Bob. Police tracked down a witness who Gary confessed murdering Mario to, and from what police can tell, Bob told Gary that Mario was going to fire him and he feared he was going to lose his union benefits. Gary then killed Mario, and Bob remained with the union and eventually became the president. Police also interviewed Gary's wife, and when they asked if Gary killed Mario, she replied, "Of course he did." The police further told the public that Gary was Mike's murderer. However, the case wasn't closed because police were still investigating if another person might have hired Gary to kill Mike or if another person was involved in his murder. Even today, the police haven't found any connection between Mike and Gary or any kind of motive behind Gary's decision to kill Mike. The only connection they can find is that they both worked in real estate, but that's a really loose connection considering Gary was done working in real estate by 1982 while Mike didn't become a real estate agent until 1990. Mary Beth told KIRO TV that she had almost given up hope that Mike's killer would be caught. She said it was agonizing waking up every morning and not knowing why this happened to Mike. What happened to Mike? Who did this? Mary Beth went on to say that it made her blood boil that a DNA testing backlog kept Gary on the streets for longer than necessary. She didn't know Gary, and while she's glad to know who killed Mike, she feels like she was denied a chance to see any justice. Mary Beth told KIRO TV, "I'm good with the fact that Kruger is dead because there's no reason why somebody that awful should be walking around society. So good, he's dead. And I know he didn't pass through the pearly gates with Mike standing there. He's in the bowels of hell, and that's where he belongs." Unfortunately, there have been no updates in any of these cases since 2012. The motive behind Mike Emert's murder remains unknown, and his family is still desperate for answers. For photos pertaining to this case, check out Mike's highlight at the top of my Instagram profile at @TheHeatherAshley and join me there on the first Monday of every month where you go live with me at 2 p.m. Eastern and we talk about this case and all other true crime cases on your mind. To get access to ad-free and bonus episodes, subscribe to our Apple Premium or head over to our Patreon at patreon.com/BigMadTrueCrime, where for just $2 whole a month, your episodes are totally ad-free. If you love the podcast, feel free to leave a review. It makes my day every single time. And if you have a case you'd like to hear covered, please share it with Big Mad True Crime on social media because all cases are covered by listener request. I'll be bringing you a brand new case next week, and I cannot wait. But until then, we out. All right, guys, we are officially at the end of this episode, which means that it's time for me to read a review that made my entire day. This one is from Lacybug, 1996. I'm guessing that's her birth year. It says, "My mom was a big true crime person, also so interested in it. She sadly passed. I love listening to these while I'm in the house. It makes me feel like I'm spending time with her again." Oh my gosh. First of all, hi, Mom. We love you. And we know that she is listening with you. This makes my heart sad and happy all at the same time. It is, oh, I want to hug you. Okay? Air hug. All right? Hug from your bestie. All right? I love this. And I love you. And you're amazing. And, oh, you broke my heart a little bit. But in a way that like also made it gleam. I hope that's the right word. Seriously, everyone hug her right now, okay? Hugs for you. We love you. You're one of us. We're your family. We love you so much. Oh my gosh. I love you so much. Okay, bye. All right, guys. If you've made it this far, we're at the hot take, and what? 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 What do you say? First of all, most successful fucking bank robbers ever. And it made me think of the Ben Affleck, RIP to that marriage, movie where they put on the old people. Or was that the Brinks movie where they robbed the Brinks? I don't know. There's a robbery movie where they put the old people thing on. But he had a distinctive gun, robbing people with distinctive guns. Anywho, excuse me, a sword cane? A knife cane? Mm-mm. I also think it's worth noting here that stabbing someone is extremely personal. Almost always, and don't quote me on that, but I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm right. It's either a crime of opportunity and that's the only weapon that you have, or it tends to be sexually motivated. I don't think that's the case here, nor was it with the other people that he stabbed. And it's interesting that there's like blunt force trauma followed by stabbing, as if the stabbing was the goal, but the blunt force trauma was a means to an end for him. But then there's ritualistic means, or whatever word I'm looking for, in these crimes. There is mafia or mob kind of hints. The fucking Parmesan, you don't know what the fuck that is. We don't know of anything that would have been found on Mike's body. We just know that the water was running and he had been dragged to the bathroom and then put into the bath. But like the cheese part wasn't a thing in this one. The fuck? And this guy, never lost any hair anywhere he went? There was hair found to test for DNA. Maybe it was hair. But when you stab somebody, you run a huge risk of cutting yourself. Whenever I see a stabbing, I almost always assume it's going to be solved because your hands obviously get wet. It is not simple to stab somebody. A lot of times, the offender's hand goes over kind of like the butt of the knife or whatever it's called, the hilt, and they cut themselves. They often need stitches or they don't get the stitches. Either way, their own blood is generally mixed in somewhere. I would assume that the blood that was tested was because of that. My dog is barking loudly because our groceries are being delivered. I'm so sorry. But it's insane to me that this seems like one of the most horrifyingly complex men. I mean, are they hits or is it we're gonna deal with the dog barking? Were they hits, hired hits, revenge, money driven? And then old wife out here being like, of course he did. What? Were you charged with things too, ma'am? I mean, yes, of course. What? Dude, no. Mm-mm. This is just horrifying. Over and over, it just got worse. It just got worse and worse. So yeah, I don't, mm-mm. And then, the disappearing man. Huh? I'm also surprised that it took so long for his body to float. I'm so confused. I have thoughts, but mm-mm. Was he gonna rob this guy of was he oh, he's a surgeon, he's gonna have money. If you're not gonna give my wife a new knee, I'm gonna steal your money. I assume you have a safe. You think you're gonna let him into the house with his wife and daughter? And good for that lady for being able to close that door. I imagine that wasn't simple to do with somebody fucking breaking in and kicking in the door. She opened it. I wonder if she was worried that it was her husband or her son and they couldn't get in the door and they maybe had groceries in their hands or something and couldn't get the door handle. I don't know. But I'm so glad she was able to slam it. I'm terrified to open the door for anyone 100% of the time. Ever in camera. Strangers scare me. I also have a dog who lets me know when people are here. So yeah, anywho, this was fucking terrible. I feel so bad for Mike's wife because she wants answers, but also she knows every time she gets any kind of answer, she's going to have to relive everything. It can't undo anything, but where there is an absence of answers, our brains naturally fill in the blanks, and that can be cruel. And it's not like we have a ton of power over what blanks it fills in. So, I don't know. I feel for her. And hopefully they do get answers at least one day. All right. I'll talk to you guys soon. I love you so much.